Who all do we have on the screen?
I'm assuming that it's Sam or somebody.
Oh, Sam Severn.
Yes.
He's a surveyor.
He's our
Attorney.
Okay.
Okay. So can I ask why the meeting is tomorrow instead of just the normal Tuesday?
Is this a special meeting? Because
Okay.
you have to notice it within a certain amount of time.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
All right, call the meeting to order.
Call the meeting to order. This is a workshop
All right.
at 6:04.
Okay. So I'm still having issues with our audio. Awesome.
It's you, not me.
Rob and Sam, I'm just checking with you guys that are you able to hear the council chambers? Okay.
No, that seemed to have stopped a couple minutes ago.
Yes, that is my experience as well. So I'm texting Dan and then I started questioning my own reality.
No, I'm getting a call. I'm gonna check that in case it's from like Dan or something. If I get bumped off.
Okay.
I just saw his truck drive by and I thought, oh, great.
Mm-hmm. No, he's on his way to the airport. He's getting flown off. Oh,
So that-
well, Zeph, I already called us to order. However, we're having technical difficulties.
Okay,
So we'll,
Dan, can you say something? I think we can hear you.
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
and this is Melissa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a little soft, but
I'm going to continue messing with the mic volumes and see if I can turn it up.
okay.
I believe that. Okay. Yeah. And so the mic is the blue light in the ceiling, guys. In case that you have any questions about where the mic is, it's probably going to pick up Drew loud and clear now since he's sitting right underneath it.
You want to slide down?
Yeah, why don't we slide down so that,
then Ben likes it if you yell into the little microphones too.
We'd have to sit on the floor.
Come on now.
Remodel. Pivot.
pivoted.
Pivot.
We are adaptable.
That's right.
We are the planning commission
Sure
and we
try.
are adaptable.
Okay. Yeah, let's turn the time over to Ms. Reinders.
All right, and I think I'm gonna turn it over to Sam and Rob. I can do a little bit of an intro, but I think we've got a PowerPoint slide to go through, but I think more importantly, kind of just topics to walk through with you all. I'm hoping this doesn't have to be overly formal, but certainly helpful for folks as you guys are walking through your roles as planning commissioner. And I think we're going to kind of tag team some of this in a very eloquent way with no awkward pauses. So, Sam, I think.
Sure. I can start. Can people hear me well?
Loud and clear.
Okay. It's very, very faint on your end, so I apologize. We're hoping to have kind of Q&A and make it a conversational tone. I can't hear anybody, so I heard loud and clear. Yeah, so we do have some slides. Are we showing, are those up or have we taken care of that? I think that'd be a good place to
I will get a share screen going here in a second. Give me a moment.
Okay. Well, while you're doing that, I don't want to just fill time, but I do want to explain one thing. Is I guess is why there's a couple of attorneys here, and to sort of, I tell you that is deliberate. I think it really helps with a more dynamic presentation, and we can kind of. Rob and I both do similar work. He did a lot more land use initially because his first career before being a city attorney and eventually the city attorney in Juneau was in private practice, doing variances, conditional use permits, that kind of work in Washington. And so we just both have different experiences in different communities and can offer a better example at times or just different way of seeing things. So I hope that is helpful. It has been in the past with presentations, helps makes things more dynamic. And so having said that, I'll wait to get a couple of.
Yeah. Can you guys see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, sir.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right, then we're ready.
Okay. So slide 1 is who we are. I think you already figured that out. Slide 2, this slide is relatively short, but I think really helps kind of set the stage as a fundamental concept as we get into some of the, as we get a little further down into talking about roles and responsibility and procedural things. And that is that the Planning Commission wears different hats. And I think that that is a fundamentally, it can be kind of challenging, but once you get a handle on it, it really does help understand things. There's a long list of the different roles of the Planning Commission in the code that's cited there. It's 1110-070. Nome's is a little longer list, which than many communities. That doesn't in and of itself really mean anything. It's just kind of noteworthy. But the two roles in large part can be broken down into legislative, or here we have it styled quasi-legislative because the Planning Commission really isn't completely a legislative body. It recommends largely. But what the Planning Commission thinks is best for the community regarding amendments to the comprehensive plan. So there you're acting as a sort of longer term, broader impact recommendation body, taking the best interest of the community as a whole into consideration. And then the other is the regulatory role or the quasi-judicial. And if you go to any of the AML conferences or something, you're just bound to bump into that term. You can't avoid it because it causes a lot of consternation. And that's because you're switching your role from just sort of a community impact minded recommending body to really acting in a sort of as a judge by committee. The way to think about that is you're deciding if a specific applicant has satisfied specific criteria, and how those roles kind of diverge later on we'll get to that. This is kind of a fundamental just understanding, and where with this, I see this just kind of anecdotally where I see this a lot of times is councils, seemingly about 95% or more of the time, are acting in that legislative role. Suddenly they get an appeal in front of them and you tell them, hey, wait a minute, everything you know about how you operate is just slightly tweaked because you're not acting in that role anymore. Now you're a judge. So we have the next slide. It has definition of this, and there are many ways to define it. This is not a, I mean, if you see another one, that wouldn't be surprising, but it's making a permit decision or an individualized decision instead of one that is based on what's best for the community as a whole, acting like a judge and a juror. And where this gets into the legal side of things is really due process principles apply. Notice, not always you got, all your meetings are subject to the Open Meetings Act, but I would say that's almost heightened here because now we're also not just looking at was the law fair as it applies to the public as a whole and their right to participate in meetings, the Open Meetings Act covers, but also
Was it fair to the parties who were there, who intended to have notice and have the public maybe interact? The hearing must be fair, and that's hard, but we'll get into that. But as a general concept, I mean, that's what due process fundamentally is. It just needs to be fair. And it requires an impartial decision maker. And that is one where ex parte communications and conflict of interest are particularly important. We have specific slides on those, and that's going to be a big part of what we get into later. But ex parte communication is one of those big distinctions between the two, the quasi-judicial and the legislative. Talking to constituents about issues that matter to them is the job when you're in the legislative role. When you're in the quasi-judicial role, that's like pulling the judge aside and just kind of having a chat with him about the issue that's going to be before him that the other side doesn't know about, that you're having that conversation. So that's one of those where understanding that distinction helps. So that, and to me, understanding it helps with a lot of these. We don't want to just memorize a lot of rules because that gets hard to remember the rules. But if you start to understand the system, I think it makes it easier. And so knowing that's where kind of understanding the distinction between the two types of actions that the body makes matters. And the conflict of interest is another big one where, again, understanding that there's sort of two big hats that the commissioners wear, the judge versus the legislative. Conflict of interest can change a little bit too, where in the legislative realm, it's really just, I think in Nome, it's in Title 2, it's just largely the financial conflict of interest. But when you get into the quasi-judicial realm, it's also looking at things like bias, appearance of fairness, and those kind of considerations. So I talk fast. We will have more detail on these things. I'm kind of hitting that high level so I don't bore anybody right out of the gate here. But just having heard that, does anybody have a question before we kind of start moving on into more of the details?
Yeah, I have a question, Sam. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah, I can hear you well now.
Okay, thanks. This is Drew McCann. So one question I have is in regards to conflict of interest with the judicial side of this, do we take into account, like, if there's a commissioner that owns property near the subject, or would that be grounds for a conflict of interest? That made me think of things I hadn't thought about before in regards to conflict of interest, and I just figured it'd be a good time to clarify.
Yes, that absolutely matters, and I might need Rob to help me out because there's a lot of case law, and I'm just kind of drawing a blank on how to explain it. But that absolutely does matter. And Rob, do you remember it's going to be a Griswold case out of Homer?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you remember the rule?
Yeah, vaguely. So you're spot on. If you own property near and a permit decision, it's super important. So let me give you a fact pattern. So let's say there's a variance. I'm going to avoid conditional use examples because of your matter tomorrow. Let's say there's a variance coming up in front of you tomorrow, and it's for, let's say, a setback variance, and you own the property on the other side of that property line. So you have a financial interest and possibly even a personal interest that the setback is maintained, or, if it's not maintained, that, you have some consideration, whether it's, a fence or some, vegetation that gets put up or something that gets put up to preserve that separation. And so you would have a conflict of interest that should be raised to the Planning Commission as soon as the variance matter is called up for presentation. You would then disclose that you own property right next door. The chair would ultimately make a ruling. You could suggest that you want to be disqualified because you don't think you can be neutral and fair. And that would be subject to the commission vetoing whatever the chair decides. That's kind of the easy example. The other extreme is, most people on the planning commission own property or rent property in the community, and there's some general kind of super small indirect interest. That's not a conflict of interest. And so you have those two extremes where you're just a general property owner versus the property owner next door. As you get closer to the subject property, that's where the conflict of interest becomes more significant. And if you're in that gray zone, it's hard. And so one of the tools that I like to use in determining whether you have a conflict that needs to be disclosed is, are you within that zone that gets notice? So I don't know Nome's code specifically, but some communities have a 500-foot notice buffer or a 200-foot notice buffer. If you're within that buffer zone that's getting notice of a variance application, then you at least have a duty to disclose that you own property in that district, and then state whether you can be neutral and fair, and then it's up to the chair to make a decision. Does that kind of help give some ground rules?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
And a real key piece that's just kind of really basic advice, but is when you make that disclosure and then just have a discussion on the record, explain why you think you can be fair, and the chair explains, why they think you should still stay. And as long as that is fleshed out and a decision is made that's fair and reasonable, that probably is sufficient to withstand scrutiny from a court. It's the failure to do that and to have kind of just put it out there that causes problems. And at the simplest, the problem might be that a court doesn't strike it down and say, well, you couldn't do this. They might just send it back and say, we don't have enough facts here, develop the facts on the record. And now we've just kind of gone back and forth for 6 months and gotten nowhere. So it's just kind of pausing and making that good record, disclosing and then making a good record.
I guess just second question while we're here. In regards to the third bullet under the due process section with impartial decision maker, have there been cases that came back that used previous planning commission meetings as a basis for saying that it wasn't impartial?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So
Okay.
Sam hinted at it. There's been a fella in Homer, Frank Griswold, who I'm not sure if he's alive anymore or not, but he was super interested in what the planning commission did in Homer and also what the city council did based on planning commission recommendations. And, to give you a sense, he actively followed the planning commission in Homer. And I know of around 8 to 10 Alaska Supreme Court cases that are based solely off of him challenging planning commission decisions or recommendations. And so there's, different communities have different interested parties. Mr. Griswold is definitely one of the most interested individuals that challenged a lot of planning commission decisions and made a lot of case law. So, we have decisions based because of his interest. We have decisions on conflict of interest. We have decisions on rezones. We have decisions on adequacy of findings. We have decisions on ex parte communication with private communication that commissioners have had. So there's a whole bunch of decisions out there. And then, Anchorage and Matsu and Juneau, everybody, some of the bigger communities in Fairbanks get their, 1 or 2 planning commission appeals a year that go to a superior court. And then, out of the group, roughly 1 or 2 of those cases go to the Alaska Supreme Court a year. So, there's somewhere between 50 and 100 cases dealing with planning commission decisions just in Alaska.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Going back to the thought that when we're acting in our quasi-judicial role, Dan is very good to give very neutral statements of fact prior to our meetings. Thank you for that. Is it fair to say that we should also not be communicating or asking too much of staff prior to the actual meeting where this is being determined? You know, like if the mayor wants to make comments or something like that, should we shut them down, or are we free to listen, or what's the?
Rob and Sam, I recommend going over the specifics of ex parte communications.
Yeah, you bet. We definitely have some slides to cover that. I'll
Great.
start off on this one and then we'll dive into some details. If you can remember one rule about ex parte communication, it's relatively simple, and it's this. If you heard about it at the hearing or in the materials for the hearing, you're okay. If you heard about it outside of that, outside of the hearing, outside of the materials, then it's like the ex parte. Staff is getting information from staff is one of the hardest topics to deal with. And I'll just preview that the best case scenario is that, and Aaron may bring this up as well, is that maybe one of the cultural changes that we could talk about here is to have staff reports that you can review before you look at a conditional use permit or a variance. And so what I mean is, before you review is, let's say the city gets and I'm just going to stick with variance again, gets a variance application for a setback. Staff, the clerk would process it, maybe send it to Aaron and say, hey, can you give me a staff report that helps identify where this is, identifies the zoning district, identifies where it is in the comprehensive plan, what comprehensive plan policies might apply, and then analyze the variance criteria and help us, with your understanding of what you think the variance criteria are and if they're satisfied, and then have a kind of a standalone page with proposed findings or conclusions, however you want to call it, that you could then say, I move to, adopt. So you would receive a staff report, you would receive a whole bunch of work from Aaron and the clerk, whoever, and then you would hold the hearing, you would get an overview from staff, you get an overview from the applicant, the public would have a chance to comment, you'd have a chance to deliberate, and then you could pass a motion, for example, if you wanted to approve the variance, that says, I move to adopt the variance consistent with these findings of fact presented here, and then you could amend those on the floor. So that's an option that we might talk about going forward.
In short, if staff then is pushing out more information that's pushed out to everyone in the form of a report or recommendations, there's just less need for any back and forth, and then it just cuts down on it and puts it all. So I think that gets us into the hearing procedures, and I think this is one that maybe if Aaron wants to lead off on this one, we can.
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I do just want to acknowledge, and maybe I should have said this at the very start, but Planning Commission, we've been going through slowly each month some training modules, and I will say that a lot of the topics that we're talking about now some of this might sound a little bit familiar, and that's because you've heard some of these phrases during those trainings, but I think is already exhibited this time with real humans as we're kind of walking through this, I think is a really a great opportunity to kind of ground truth, like how do we live into this stuff, and and kind of brainstorm and kind of get guidance from Rob and Sam and and I, and then each other. So I just want to just acknowledge that. So this is a great time, I think. All right. So the last slide, we kind of started talking about the public hearings and when that happens. So how these hearing procedures go. there is some flexibility with like how these flow. I think I would, there's a lot of flexibility. I've seen it done several different ways. So it's kind of mapped out here, is a suggested flow for how I've seen it done before. And it works well. It kind of gives everybody a chance to speak and kind of builds off of each other. So how this can go typically is staff would give an introduction. Like Rob was saying, sometimes this can be paired with a staff report that has already been given to you guys. But basically staff would talk kind of about some of the high points of the application, link that to what the code requirements are, just to kind of set the stage for the conversation, so that you guys are kind of empowered and, you know, have that backing. Then it's, you know, oftentimes would be when the applicant kind of presents what they are proposing, you know, acknowledge how they are meeting the code requirements. That could also be a time where you ask them some questions that you have about the application itself and what they're proposing. Then after you've kind of get that solid background of what is being proposed, kind of you've got a good feel for the code requirements on all of that stuff, then you can open it up to the public for their comments. And this is why I would say that it's, I like to have the staff and an applicant go first, because then you're putting all of that information out there. And I think allowing for the public comments to have already kind of heard all of that information. So everybody's kind of walking into those into the public hearing portion with the same level of information. So then it's open up for public comments. And again, that can be written comments or oral comments that, you know, folks that are in the room. You can ask clarifying questions of the public when they are, you know, when they are presenting. I would say definitely keep those. And I think this is for the applicant side too, right? So like keep those questions really focused in on understanding and clarifying, because at this point you're just trying to collect what the concerns are, what the facts are about the project. You're just trying to kind of understand what those implications could be, you know, if a project were to move forward. And I would say now is not the time to get into the debate. You know, that is when the Planning Commission is actually entering into its deliberation phase, you know, as you're kind of going through those, the code requirements and hashing some of all of that stuff out. So again, clarification, then you go ahead and close the public hearing, and then you get to begin deliberation. So kind of taking all that you've heard, comparing that to code. If you've got a staff report that kind of gives you some guidance on that, you can kind of use some of that. Thinking through. But again, this is where you start tying things back to code. So decisions based on findings of fact and conclusions of law. And we'll get into some code requirements in a couple of slides. So we'll dig into some of that a little bit later. I will say there's the bottom of this slide. Code allows the Planning Commission to go ahead and adopt rules of procedure that kind of would list out the flow of a hearing like this. And that might be something worth exploring as we move forward as well, but just planting that seed at this point. That's all I've got there.
Thanks, Erin. I wanted to add in a couple of things, and maybe Rob has some ideas too, but there's a couple of bullets in there that are questions to inform and clarify and don't argue with presenter. And they're almost kind of sub bullets, but I think that they're those are pretty important. And when I sit in a lot of these, various hearings or CUP and variance issues all over the state, and where I see, or even just council meetings, and I think especially these quasi judicial ones, when they go well, is generally when there's a limited amount of just argument in general, whether that's between the decision making body and whoever's talking, or I certainly not amongst one another. If there's time for rebuttal or something, so be it. But otherwise, it's if people get their 3 minutes or their 5 minutes, they get it. And I think sometimes there's a desire we want to make people feel like they've been heard, of course. I mean, having a fair hearing, and that's what the body's there for. But it's not a town hall meeting, it's a decision making meeting. And so the types of questions would generally be, why in your application I see you proposed this, but why? Or, had you considered this? I mean, if they're really pointed, but for the most part, it's, I think about it like a judge. And if anybody sat and watched in court, it's pretty funny what judges will do is they'll sit there for 2 hours and listen to somebody testify. And then finally, after all that, they just open their mouths, which is very rare, and just ask the one question they actually want to know the answer to. And that's it. Otherwise, it's really on the parties to speak. And the way to make people feel like they're heard is, rather than having to engage in a debate and a conversation with them, because things can just get really unwieldy, is when you're making deliberations or any kind of written findings, then show that you took their concerns into consideration. And that will, that goes a long way. So the other thing, the Planning Commission rules of procedure, the code does allow for that, and some places do just fine without it. And if the rules are relatively skeletal, we're always able to navigate meetings and help insert them. But it is something to consider, and that could be some places have a 15-page version. That's too much, or longer. Nobody can find their way through it, let alone agree on how to amend it or draft it in the first place. A 5 to 10-page version. There's models for that out there, and that gives you a chance to craft, within the code and within the due process, just the legal rules, but to craft what you want it to look like. And there's a couple of intangible effects that come from making those rules that I think have value. Is one, the process of writing it drives positive debate about what the rules ought to be and look like. And it also allows everybody to coalesce around feeling like they've got a unified agreement on what they want this to look like. But it also can, cut through any kind of debate in public where you can say, no, look, that's our rules. We've agreed on it. It's Rule 11. It can make things go quicker. So you don't need it, but it is definitely something to consider. I don't know if we want to move on, or that's a lot. Do people have questions about that?
Just to clarify, the proposed changes to that would be through the city council, correct? Or would it be a recommendation from the planning commission to the city council to adopt those?
I can take that one. Yeah, you're spot on. So I think it's under the planning commission's powers. You have the ability to do all the legwork and then propose the rules to council, but council would have to adopt them. I can take these next couple slides if you want. So going on the theme of a fair hearing in a quasi-judicial setting, there's 3 concepts on this slide just to talk about. One is going back to that ultimate rule that you need to make decisions based on the information that you receive at the hearing. So, types of information you receive, potentially a staff report, but definitely the application, any public comments, written public comments that are submitted in the packet ahead of time, the applicant's testimony, the public comments, any staff introduction and insights, all that material is fair game for you to make decisions on. And then, the middle point is going back to that kind of overarching rule that I articulated earlier, is that if you didn't find out the information during the hearing, you may have ex parte communication. And I say may because we have a couple more slides on ex parte communication, and there's ways to deal with it. The classic places where you get ex parte communication are you run into the applicant in the grocery store, or your neighbor sees you doing something on a Sunday afternoon in your driveway or in your yard and says, hey, what do you know about this? Or you bump into somebody in the grocery store. Those are the kind of classic ways to get exposed to ex parte information. And let me get to this next slide. So big picture kind of methods to deal with ex parte communication. One, try to avoid it. So if a neighbor comes up to you and starts talking about it, or if the applicant, it's the applicant, comes up to you and starts talking about it, try to avoid any conversation about planning commission matters. And then if somebody starts into it, with a sentence or so, just stop them and say, hey, I can't discuss this with you right now because it's a planning commission matter. Feel free to come to the planning commission meeting and provide your comment. That's a nice way to, avoid the grocery store uncomforts. If for some reason, and this happens because small communities, you get into a discussion with somebody and then you realize a month later, 3 months later, oh, shoot, this was coming to the planning commission. I didn't realize it. That's okay. We're humans. It's small community. If that happens, you disclose it. So let's stick with my variance example. At the beginning of the meeting, the variance is called up for the topic. You raise your hand and say, Chair, I need to disclose a potential ex parte, issue. And then just describe what happened. That you had a conversation with a neighbor outside, 3 months ago. You didn't realize it was related to this material, or you had a conversation with the applicant 6 months ago, didn't realize it was a planning commission matter, or it was a grocery store contacted, bumped into the person. Whatever it is, just summarize it. Describe, what facts may have been exchanged, what arguments may have been exchanged, somebody's opinions, whatever you want to call them. And then, so you're disclosing it. And then the ultimate test is, do you think you can still be neutral and fair? And if you can, say so. And if you can't, say so. And then let the chair rule. And then, the whole body can veto it if the body wants to. But that's kind of the saga of ex parte communication options. Any questions on that?
Following down your same path, and you'll probably give me the answer. Lawyers love it, depends. But being that this is a small town and everybody knows everybody's business, it seems like, if the communication has happened before it's been noticed, before the planning commission knows that it's coming to their attention a year ago, and there was a discussion, is that still a matter that needs to be disclosed as ex parte communication, or are there some parameters around once it's been noticed and it's coming to the planning commission? Or
Yeah, great question. If you can remember the conversation, it should be disclosed. So it's kind of a self red face test type of answer. So if you can't remember it, then obviously it wasn't important to you enough to remember it, or it was too long ago. But if you can remember it, you should disclose it.
I had a question for you, Rob.
Yeah.
Well, so take into account that 3 of these commissioners have only been on the planning commission since maybe October or more recent. And so there's a good chance that maybe they have had discussions revolving this crew camp, although the conditional use permit wasn't put in until this year and wasn't noticed until late last week. And so could that even be considered ex parte?
Yeah, great question. Short answer, yes. And so if, the overarching theme, kind of like Sam said, you don't have to memorize the rules if you understand the system or the kind of the policies behind it. The overarching policy is we want to make sure the planning commission's hearing's fair. And part of that means you have to have a neutral decision maker or an impartial decision maker, so an impartial commissioner. And so even if a commissioner had worked for some entity that has an application in front of you, or took a position publicly or privately, and you remember that, even if it's a long time ago, that's something that should be disclosed. And it's up, the two phrases that I keep coming back to is, can you still be neutral and fair? Can you evaluate the application just based on the material in the application, whatever's in the packet, and the material that's presented at the hearing? If you can be neutral and fair, say so. And, usually the chair would say you can continue to maintain your seat. But if for some reason you've taken such hard positions, or you know too much about what's going on, and you disclose that and you say, I don't think I can be neutral and fair because I've got all this background information, you need to say so. And that's okay. That's the whole process of having a planning commission based on citizens in the community instead. And I'll just say the alternative is a hearing officer model, where typically it's a super experienced planner like Aaron, or potentially an experienced attorney who makes decisions. So it's one person who's making decisions, usually not from the community. And so, there's pros and cons to both of those. It's more objective, but you lose the cultural importance and community values.
Well, since Rob just touched on that, I'll just throw that out there as kind of an educational piece, is that some communities on these quasi-judicial things have just decided under their code that it's more efficient for them to defer it to a neutral, more efficient or result in better decision making. I'm not sure which, but they just by code farm this out to an individual person, and there's a state agency that does it, or it can just be a matter of calling around and finding the right person to do it, and then they just take the role on, acting like an individual judge. I'm not recommending that or anything else. It's not necessarily more common than the way Nome is doing it, but that's, I guess, what Rob's referring to.
So I have another slide on, and it says the kind of the same things as the prior two slides, but in a different way, just to help emphasize this point. So from top to bottom is kind of a continuum. Try to avoid the ex parte contact. If you can't, and it's what I call is de minimis, so small contact, disclose, or you become disqualified. And so, like I said, at the beginning of the hearing, summarize the contact if you can. Sometimes you can do it in writing if there's a bunch of material, but usually it's an oral summary. And then state if you're unbiased. So going back to my two themes, can you be neutral and fair? If you can, great. This is the interesting process step that I just wanted to highlight with this slide, is the applicant, anybody who received notice, and anybody who's at that hearing, even if they're in the audience, can raise their hand and object. And then they don't have to say anything. And usually they can't say too much, but they can raise their hand and object. And then that forces the chair to have to make a decision. And that's fine. The chair is empowered to do that and expected to do that. That's one of the Frank Griswold cases out of Homer, set that rule up. And if there's no objection, then the commissioner can participate. If there is an objection, the commission then decides what to do. Sometimes the commission says, we think the ex parte communication is de minimis. Commissioner says they can be neutral and fair, so they can participate in the hearing. Sometimes the commission says, nope, too much. We don't think you can be neutral and fair, even if you said you can, and you're temporarily out for this matter. And then obviously if it's super extensive, disclose and you're likely disqualified. So I think that's the last slide on ex parte communication, so the private communication, and be happy to help answer questions and work through this if there are any comments.
So if you have had some type of communication like this, is this brought up?
Is this something that you contact staff about and let them know ahead of time, or is this something that gets brought up on the record during the meeting, and that's when the public has the, excuse me,
the chance to say something, to object?
Yeah, good point. So it's nice to give the chair a heads up. And if the chair's, the normal planning commission chair is not going to be there, whoever the deputy chair is, give them a heads up that it's coming so they're not caught off guard. Some communities also like to involve staff, specifically the clerk or potentially the primary person who's staffing, taking notes for the meeting if it's not the clerk. That to me is a cultural issue. That's a community issue that if you guys want to lay that expectation out, you can say so. But the easy answer is make sure the chair knows just so they can think about it ahead of time.
Thank you.
I guess just for us knowing this, it's probably important, one, because I would assume that that there could be a scenario where an applicant doesn't want a planning commissioner to decide on their matter and potentially get baited to be disqualified. Is that a fair risk?
Yeah, it definitely can be a risk. And so it just being aware of these rules is important. And, if something happened a year ago and you weren't on the planning commission, you weren't even interested in becoming a planning commissioner, no problem. And just disclose it now that you are a commissioner and, state if you can be neutral and fair. And remember, the key touchstone here is that when you say you can be neutral and fair, it's just that you can make the permit decision solely based on the information that you receive at the hearing. And if you can push that other material and conversations that you had a year ago or 3 years ago out, you got a fair chance of being able to be neutral and fair and the chair agreeing with you.
Well, I think the other thing that the disclosing does is it does bring about an overall just culture of credibility too, that it is a small town. And so if you start doing those disclosures, people see that. And I've stood in court and watched a judge do it with me and say, well, just so everybody knows, I mean, I played on a flag football team with Sam when we were first new attorneys in Anchorage, and I haven't really talked to him much since, but we do have that. And instead of it being like a weird thing, where the other attorney goes, oh man, do we need to be worried about that? It's kind of this moment where everybody's like, okay, it's a small town. I get that. It increases credibility by just knowing that the person is thinking that hard about it and trying to be fair and transparent. So it's not something to necessarily avoid. You can kind of embrace it, but through the disclosure process.
One more quick question. How about having conversations after the fact that have been like having a conversation about a meeting that was had happened prior to that? As long as it's public information, are you allowed to discuss things like that with other people, or is that just something you should avoid?
Yeah. So this one's a little tricky, and I'll tag team this one maybe with Sam. So there's an appeal window. If you're having a conversation, usually it's 15, 20 days, 30 days at most. If the planning commission makes a variance decision, tonight, and somebody wants to talk to you about it in May and June, no problem. Like, the appeal window's done. That's a past act. There's really no way for it to come back in front of you. So you're free to talk about it. In that appeal window, in that short appeal window from the planning commission appeal to city council, the best practice is not to talk about it, because, if for some reason, a neighbor appeals or the applicant appeals to city council and the city council says, no, planning commission, we think you screwed up on a process piece or on a substantive piece, and sends it back to you to what's called a remand or reverse and remand. If the city council sends it back to you, then you would be in a position where you've got this ex parte communication you'd have to disclose. And if it's significant, you've probably disqualified. If it's not, then you get to continue being a commissioner for that matter. I don't know, Sam or Aaron, if you had any other thoughts on that.
No, I think that that's it. It really is kind of that appeal window is, I think, the key to that. And yeah, that's it. I guess what I was thinking, it was just that there's a certain value to being able to talk about it afterward, because you can't really adequately talk about how to make the process better, how to correct your own errors. But that would be largely talking about it. Not so much with the person at the grocery store or the applicant, but internally. No, I think that's it.
All right. I think this is my slide. So as we kind of think about the role of the Planning Commission, one of those roles is to consider conditional use permit requests. So the purpose, and I think we did hit on some of this in our training earlier, but so you will see conditional use permit requests. And the way I've talked about this before, conditional uses, is that we have our zoning districts, and you can kind of divide land uses in 3 different buckets with zoning. So you have the yeses, the things that are permitted, that are always allowed so long as they meet basic standards. Then you have the no's, the things that are not allowed in any district or in a said district. And then you have the maybes. And so the conditional uses are those maybes. So Nome's code actually lists out that maybe bucket. So the Nome's code actually lists out the land uses that are considered for conditional uses within each zoning district, which actually I think kind of helps focus in the discussion when we're talking about conditional uses. And then, so that first question is that use eligible for a conditional use? And then if it's listed in the code as one that is allowed to be considered, then the answer is yes. And then the Planning Commission has 3 main options for as you guys consider the conditional use permit request. So one is to approve it. And we'll get into what that all requires in a little bit, to deny it, or to approve it with conditions. And that really is the tool for conditional uses. It's really a way of finding how things can work to protect the surrounding neighborhood, and identifying when it just can't work. So when a use is identified as a potential conditional use for a particular zoning district, it definitely is a maybe. So it's not just that it's otherwise it would say it was permitted. So those are the sorts of things, the options that you have. And I guess I'll kind of looking at that 4th bullet point. And again, we'll get into this, I think, in the next slide. But if the Planning Commission finds that the impacts of that use are so great that a condition can't make it better, then really the Planning Commission has to deny it. So it's and there's clear criteria set out in code to kind of help the Planning Commission make that decision. And I think with that, it's probably best if we switch the slides. There we go. So when a conditional use permit request comes to you, the code gives really specific guidance, criteria to work through. So you're not deciding whether or not you like the project or don't like the project. You're really framing the question of, does the application meet this criteria? And I think that seems to, I've experienced, has really kind of taken the pressure off of, as you're trying to decide, because it's not whether or not you like it or not, it's does it meet this criteria? So here's kind of a checklist of sorts, right? So does so legal and plan conformance, like does it satisfy Nome's code and align with the comprehensive plan? Will it substantially alter the character of that surrounding area and substantially harm that zoning district? We think about traffic and circulation impacts. Does what is being proposed create hazardous conditions for pedestrians or vehicles in the area? We also have to consider public services, right? So can the water, sewer, drainage, fire protection handle what is being proposed without an undue burden? And then there's kind of this, does it impact, are potential neighborhood impacts able to be mitigated? So things that we think about here are noise, the scale of the building, hours of operation. So these kind of then end up serving as your guideposts of whether or not you can approve a conditional use permit, and if you can approve it, do you have to approve it with some conditions? I'm going to pause there. I think we'll kind of get into a discussion about conditions coming up next, but are there, I guess, questions from folks, or Sam or Rob? Am I going over stuff too quickly and leaving important facts out?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate it. I do think your point to me makes a lot of sense, is that we don't have to get involved in guesswork about whether it's a good idea or whether we like it or not. If we stick with the checklist, that will guide the discussion where it needs to go.
And I would also say, Sam, I think it was Sam, it might have been Rob, that we're talking about like how we can acknowledge to members of the public that we hear them. I think sometimes it's as we walk through this review criteria that we can kind of, the Planning Commission might be able to reference things that were mentioned in the public hearing, as something that, was a concern that was identified. So that's one thought.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And right where I was using it is, we don't need to necessarily engage in an ongoing debate to make it seem like people are heard. And I think a lot of those, these come up all the time. You see a lot of people will line up to comment about, just looking at the code right here with traffic, activity levels, noise. That's not, people will, and so then we can show that we're hearing that by working on conditions to mitigate those things.
Yep.
In regards to those conditions, when they impact neighborhoods or areas that maybe previously haven't been noticed, what does that do to the process? So for instance, if a condition is placed by the Planning Commission that requires something, whether it's traffic impacts or other neighborhood impacts, to be done as part of that approval, is there another notice or anything that goes out to those further impacted properties or neighbors? Or no?
I can take that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with the conditions to be thinking about, so the short answer is no, there's no additional notice that goes out unless the Planning Commission postpones the hearing to another date, specifically to say we want more notice to go out, to this neighborhood or to this area of the community. But if that doesn't happen, the short answer is no, there's no additional notice. And think about conditions as being things that the applicant is responsible for doing. And so let's just go with, let me go to the next slide here to give other people a chance to think about questions about impacts and conditions. But let's focus on this top left one, traffic. If this, the application of CUP were to drive a lot of traffic concerns, so you hold a hearing members of the public raise a lot of concerns over traffic, whether it's the size of the vehicles, single tractor trailers, double tractor trailers, if it's the width, the weight of the vehicles based on the road conditions, the sheer volume of the vehicles moving in and out, whatever the issues are, if there are impacts, on a neighboring street or an adjacent neighborhood that are super relevant and directly related to that particular application, and you think there's conditions that need to be imposed, like, potentially you can only run heavy vehicles during 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. or something, like, so hours of operation could be a condition. Or you could say, no double tractor trailers in after dark, just because, people don't anticipate having, too long trailers behind a tractor trailer in our community. So you can limit the type of use. Or, if, in order to make this particular application work, say, there's a whole bunch of kids that cross at this intersection that's a half a block away or a block away, you need to put up a flashing yellow sign that's activated by buttons on either side of the road. Whatever those conditions are that you think are reasonable, the applicant is the one who has to install them and do them and maintain them. And so while there may be an impact on a neighborhood, it's the applicant who you need to be focused on. And so for that reason, usually you don't have to give additional notice to those other areas, unless for some reason there's been a fundamental kind of misunderstanding, or the notice that went out was just unreasonably too low, and the commission as a whole thinks you need to do more.
Thank you.
So I think let's leave it on this slide for a second, and I can kind of talk through this topic a little bit more. So when we're talking about conditions, it's best if we if the Planning Commission thinks about what you're trying to address first. So like we've already said, every zoning district has those list of uses that are yeses, right? Like the permitted land uses. So those are uses that have already been defined as being compatible with the zoning district with basic standards. So it's the conditional uses that are identified that have the potential of having greater or different impacts than those kind of by right permitted uses. And so your job as the Planning Commission is to identify what some of those different impacts are. And again, I'm going to bring it back to the criteria that we just went through. That criteria list often helps you kind of walk through that thought process. So basically, if your answer to the questions regarding those standards in the slide right before this one, for any one of those was like, well, it sort of does. Maybe it would be okay if fill in the blank. And that's kind of your clue that maybe a condition of approval for the conditional use permit might be appropriate. So like an example could be, kind of looking at this list and thinking through, I think this list does a great job in kind of thinking through it, listing out some of the topics that come up from the criteria. But basically, so if you have an auto repair shop that's being proposed in a commercial district, which is would be a conditional use, some of those impacts could be increased traffic, noise from equipment, outdoor storage of vehicles. So those are impacts that wouldn't normally be associated with a use that's allowed in a commercial district. So at that point, then you can kind of have a discussion of, well, are those conditions being addressed with the proposal, or can they be addressed with the condition, with a different condition of approval? And then so you can kind of walk through that discussion of what would it take to alleviate some of those impacts. In the lower 48, oftentimes it's lots of screaming, but I think those are. But I think this list up here kind of helps you identify some of the issues, and then you can kind of walk through what is reasonable, what is a way that the applicant could modify their plan or add to their plan or document something that demonstrates that the impact would be alleviated and be similar to what the other land uses that are already approved for that zoning district, what impacts they would provide. And I'm going to pause because that was a lot, but I'm happy to answer questions if there's anything out there at this point, or Sam or Rob, if you want to add.
Nothing for me.
Okay. I think that's all I've got for this slide then.
When would be the proper time to bring extra or other things up like that? Is that during, I mean, if the planning commission already reads through that list and for some event in the future, thinks they have a list of other conditions that they may want to add to that, is that something you do before you have the actual hearing? Or is that something that comes up during? Because if it's something that you want the applicant to address, it would make sense to have them know about it ahead of time so they have answers and a plan in place, right? But you would have to have a special meeting for that?
No, because if you were having that conversation, then that would fall into the ex parte conversation path. Yeah. Although we've got two attorneys that I'm hoping I just said that what they would agree with.
This is one of those fun little problem solving areas. Easy answer and more complicated answer. So easy answer, the applicant should be ready to address those things at a commission hearing. And if you lay out 6, 10, 20 questions to the applicant because you anticipate, issues are going to be raised in public comment and the applicant cannot answer those questions to your satisfaction, you have two options. If the rest of the commission agrees with you, the hearing goes through, you then move and deny the application, or more commonly, you say, you know what, I move to postpone the hearing to another date, 2 weeks from now, a month from now, a week from now, whatever it is, so we can get more information from the applicant to answer our questions and concerns. And that is perfectly reasonable. And I tend to see that happen when there are really contentious hearings for the community. And, in some communities, it may be a dog boarding facility. People are really interested about dogs barking. People have a lot of strong emotions to dogs. And other places, it can be mines. I've had mining applications delayed, a hearing held, delayed another month and another month before the planning commission holds a hearing and finalizes their decision. I could give other examples, but each community is a little different and each application is a little different. But that's the easy answer, is ask the applicant at the hearing. The more complicated answer is what Aaron hinted at, is that you can't ask the applicant ahead of time, but there is a way, if you have a staff report, to have that, question conversation with your staff, and then the staff then analyzes those questions and presents feedback to you ahead of time. Everybody gets the questions, everybody gets the staff report, everybody gets the answers that staff is presenting. That's an option. It's a little cumbersome, but it exists if you need it.
You can ask questions during the public hearing piece before deliberations about your own thoughts on proposed conditional? What are they called? Conditional or conditional?
Conditions.
Or
Yeah,
added conditions of the conditional use.
yeah, you bet.
And you could ask that, I would say, if you've got it sounded like you were describing a scenario where you would have questions for the applicant. And I think you would inquire with the applicant during their presentation, because you could frame it of, following up on what they're actually proposing, if they have addressed something that you're concerned with, that sort of thing. So I think that would be a good time to do it.
Yeah, the public hearing section where the public is allowed to comment is not supposed to be a question and answer session. It's that for them to give their 2 cents and sometimes in a timed and controlled environment, if they are going on and on and on and on, you can make a time limit if we need to, but that's not a question and answer session.
I've also seen in meetings where when you're getting the same consensus over and over, and you've got a list of people in the room that are all sharing the same thing, where the chair will maybe make a statement that says, if you all have this same opinion or you have this same thing that you want to share with the commission, can you signify? And then basically on the record, you would have that all these same people had that same consensus.
I think an example too on like conditions where I've seen is, you can ask just productive questions to learn more. Like if everybody's concerned about too much light, I didn't previously have a giant outdoor storage facility next to my, wherever, and now you're going to do one. Isn't there going to be lights on at night? You can ask questions like, have you looked at shades on the lights to project the light downward to where it needs to be, as opposed to glancing around all over the neighboring places? Well, no, I haven't. Or yes, I have, and it would cost me an extra $75,000. That shading thing is okay. I mean, you don't want to get into a debate there, but I mean, that's where some of those clarifying questions of just, have you looked into that? What would that take? And a lot of times you might learn something from that. Maybe they have, and they have a intelligent reason why they've ruled it out, or some state regulation that you weren't aware of. So there's a little bit of that Q&A is helpful.
There will be a time that if the public comments, you hear the applicant, then the public, and then there may be a time that we need to go back and ask questions of the applicant post public comment.
Right. I guess what I was talking about was very much more toward the applicant than the public comments, but.
Madam Chair, may I ask a question? Yeah. Hey, guys, this is Lee. The staff report itself should cover a lot of these issues that might be in question. When they go in and look at, because the staff should be as soon as they apply, that's where the work begins. And that's where you're working with the staff to come up with that staff report that says, and I have that previous slide, we agree on this as staff, we agree on this, we agree on this, we hand it to you. That's cool. We have one we do not agree on. So back to you, Commission, there may be some in total question, but it should be in the staff report. You shouldn't have, as a commission, be hashing it out. See what I'm saying? That staff report is a statement of fact and research based on your plans, that type thing. So that's why, in fact, I texted Aaron just a moment ago and said that very thing. As 4 decades later, being on planning commissions, that was in fact, we would get it a few days early, the staff, and we would have sometimes board members would go and talk to the staff and say, help me understand it before the meeting. That's fine. I mean, in fact, that's same with council members. You call up, we have an agenda, Mark may call and say, give me a little clarity on that. That way he goes in with better data. So anyway, that staff report is so important. It's very, I mean, that gives you guys cover. And I just put a lot of emphasis on that staff report and the details.
Most of the time that staff report is gold. Sometimes it's gold for the applicant, sometimes it's gold for the public, but it's always gold for the planning commission.
Well, one of the other benefits with that too is trying to craft a condition effectively on the fly that's, you know, reasonably enforceable, understandable. To do that verbally is very challenging, and the staff just has the ability to do that, you know, quiet or not under fire. And it's going to be usually more reasonably thought out too. So
Staff appreciates that as well. Although I have had several examples where councils and commissions have gone into recess to allow time for the crafting of conditions. So that if you're almost there and you don't want to defer to another meeting, I've seen that done fairly successfully too. And I think it is important that we do kind of call that out as a potential, like, as good of a staff report as there might be, or as like complete as an application might be. Sometimes other things come up during the public hearing, which is the purpose of that public hearing, you know. So I think there very well could be times where the planning commission might want to consider adding another condition, and so it's kind of good to think through how that might work.
And just through that process, what does that look like? Okay, you have your public hearing and you close the public hearing, and then you start the deliberation, or you go to recess before that? Which...
No, typically it's gonna, like, that question, you know, of I want to add a condition for this reason, that comes up during the deliberation.
And so if you were to go into recess, for the planning commission, is it closed or is it just more informal discussion, but with the public still in attendance?
Oh,
Maybe I can help a little bit on that
yeah.
one. Yeah, so let's go with the variance example again. You know, applicants done their presentation, you've asked questions to the applicant. 3 people in the public came up and made some comments. Maybe you've asked questions of the public. Maybe you bring the applicant back up to clarify a few things, and then you close the public hearing. Commission is deliberating. We want to grant the variance. You know, we heard these concerns from the public. We need to address. Second, how do we want to phrase this? You know, let's say it's a setback issue. You know, do we want to prohibit lighting in the setback? How do we say that? Well, maybe we take a brief recess, have a conversation. You know, one commissioner, like the chair, has a conversation with, you know, the staff member or another commissioner, and they work up the language, you know, while everybody else is having, you know, a snack or whatever, going to the bathroom. And then 2 minutes later, 7 minutes later, whatever it is, chair brings the meeting back to order and says, you know, here's a proposed condition that says no lighting shall be allowed in the setback that reflects or is pointed offsite, so onto neighboring properties. And so you work that condition up in the recess, and then you have it, and then you keep going. Does that help?
It does.
Yeah.
And I stopped the slideshow because that was our last slide, and looks like we were into some good comments and questions. You know, maybe I can help kind of close it up a little bit then. If you remember kind of two things out of this presentation. One would be the Planning Commission wears two different hats. When you're making permit decisions, you're wearing your quasi-judicial hat. When you're making recommendations to the council, you're wearing your community or legislative hat. So that would be one thing. And then the second thing is be fair when you're making your quasi-judicial decisions. Fairness has a lot of different flavors. It looks different for some different communities. Some communities, maybe that means you have time limits for public comment. Some communities, it means you've got really strict limits on when people can submit written material ahead of time. Whatever it is, be fair. And if you want help drafting some Planning Commission rules of procedure, Aaron and Sam and I are here to help you draft those. And if the commission wants to, pivot to requiring staff reports, we can try to figure out how to help you get to that point where staff reports would become a normal thing. So just remember, you wear two different hats, figure out what hat you're wearing, and then be fair if you're wearing that quasi-judicial hat. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure to get to work with the commission tonight, and hopefully we'll make a in-person visit out there and be able to see you in person.
One question, if we do want to have time limits on speakers, it would be for the public comment, and should that be set at the beginning of the meeting as opposed to like in the middle of public comment?
Yes, ideally. Yeah, absolutely. And there's different way. I mean, anybody, if Aaron or Rob have a different way of looking at this, I think you could flexibly enough, even if you don't have them just verbally, the chair could say, we anticipate that those will be limited to 5 minutes. Better yet would be put that limitation even just in the agenda, just so it's written down and nobody's surprised. Or more formal would be putting it in the commission rules. But yes, in advance is good. Definitely preferable. And that's that fairness piece where it's just if everybody walks in knowing what the rules are, then nobody thinks that the rule was crafted for them.
Mr. Chair, I had a comment on that. So, in the past with other commissions and the council, both for the staff presentation and applicant presentation, those could be limited. And I would just preface it that you have this amount of time, staff, you have this amount of time, presenter, applicant. Same with when you recess into public comment, you can preface that with just saying public comments are limited to X amount of time per individual. You get one chance to speak your piece, X amount of time, so you don't have people just coming back up and coming back up. I just saw something else, and yeah, because that really can drag on, and it'll force them to put a little bit more thought into the day before they get up. I mean, yes, you like they said, you can write it into the agenda. It's something that if the Planning Commission wants in the future, we could come up with some more specific. I mean, like I could put in round brackets under the citizens' comments. 5-minute comments. Just something that is kind of a little bit of a heads up kind of a thing. Another thing that we've talked about doing in the past with the chairperson is whomever that may be, we could have a guide that helps guide the chairperson through actions within the meeting until they get confident enough to just do it blindly, just easily.
Right.
And if that's something that you need, you let me know.
Yeah. Yes.
Would there be a time that, or would it be proper, I guess, to if you get into the meeting or right before the meeting starts and the room starts filling out, to make that decision and do an amendment to the agenda to add a time limit? I guess, are there any downsides of that?
Yeah, you can have that flexibility. I can give you a couple different examples. I've worked with different commissions. Many commissions have a 2-minute time limit or maybe a 3-minute time limit. Unlike
most people can get their point across in 2 to 3 minutes. Attorneys seem to need to take a lot longer, but push that aside. So let's say a commission has a rule that's in the packet or an agenda that says 3 minutes. But then as the room starts filling up, let's say there's 15, 20, 30, 40 people in the room, the chair calls that agenda item up and says, before we get started, I just want to show of hands of people who plan on talking or who might want to talk. And let's say, everybody raises their hand. If that happens, the chair could say, look to the commission, say, our normal rule is to allow people unlimited time, or maybe 3 minutes, whatever it is. But I'd like to impose a 90-second rule or a 1-minute rule tonight, just because there's so many people, and I want to make sure we hear everybody,
1 minute.
but also get through this matter tonight. You can do that. And I've had one case go to the Supreme Court where we had, I think, 60-second time limits on people because there were so many interested people.
I don't think I could say my name in that amount of time.
Same thing. Hi, my name is Bob.
Another piece that I often advise on is like, we also want to be, again, it's that fairness piece. So if somebody says, look, I appreciate that you just changed the rules to 90 seconds, but I'm the head of this neighborhood community group and I have a couple of slides that's going to take me 2 minutes. May I, through the chair, have permission to do, maybe that's just all depends on the field, but maybe that's a reasonable deviation if the person really is trying,
Sure.
That's where it gets adding that strictness, but then is there still some flexibility within that? It's kind of a feel thing. But if you impose those rules and then follow them uniformly, it's remarkable to watch, like in communities where the, just 3-minute council comments thing, when that's enforced with a countdown clock and everything else, after a while, everybody just knows. So I was halfway through my sentence, but the culture here is to just quit now. I don't need to be reminded of it. Buzzer went up, I'm done. Over time, that becomes just the standard.
Oh, I love that. I
We
love
can
that.
afford a buzzer.
Maybe there's not a literal buzzer. Some places there is.
Oh, I would
The
love
clock goes
I
to
have a
0
call.
and everybody kind of looks. It's like, well, sorry you didn't talk fast enough.
Yeah.
How you feel, Zoe?
Feel pretty well. In regards to fairness, I know a lot of the actions of this board and this commission are subject to appeal. Are conditions that we deliberate and decide on also subject to appeal, either by the applicant or potentially even our city council is our next filter for these types of projects?
Yeah.
Short answer, yes. Yeah, so the applicant who may be disgruntled with a decision you made or with specific conditions, they could appeal that decision and specifically say, I think, imposing this condition is unreasonable for these reasons, or alternatively, neighbors, if you grant a permit, neighbors can appeal if the conditions they think are unreasonable don't protect their interests enough. So yes, conditions can be appealed.
Could the city council potentially appeal them in potentially in sort of a more informed light, in the sense as in they see our recommendations come from us or our conditions, and then they say we want to apply further or other things like that, or are we kind of that one rung on the ladder that if we miss our chance to recognize certain conditions that the city council could not then recuse the applicant to further or more exaggerated conditions? Is that?
I can take this one because I just dealt with this. Subject to reviewing Nome's code specifically about appeals to the council, but in general, the council can also add or modify conditions on appeal. That's been my experience, and I could double check Nome's. Is that kind of what you're?
Precisely, yes. Thank you very much.
The nuance though with what Sam just said is that somebody has to appeal that decision to the council, then council has the right.
Right. The council cannot be the appellant.
That's correct. Okay. That gets tricky. If we end up needing to get into that zone, we'll analyze it on a case-by-case basis. That is a super tricky issue. And for example, just put it out there, could a council member appeal
I heard
if they have some interest? Yes, they could. Would they then be able to sit as a council member in that appeal? No, because they have a conflict of interest in it. But we can get into those details if we need to later.
Thank you, guys.
Madam Chair, it always is good to let if someone mentioned it, and I just think it needs to be mentioned again, the presenters, to let them complete their presentation. Because you will get sometimes the audience trying to, no, not even, you guys or us, we want them to finish it, then questions. Because I found it confuses the people doing I also think it's not fair, and then write your questions down and be ready for them. That's just how I've done it. It seems to be fair between the applicant and, whoever the legislative body is. So.
I don't have any. Does anybody have any other questions or comments?
Move to adjourn, or do you need that for work session? Sweet.
Melissa can say that we're adjourned.
We're adjourned at 7:34.